Okay, welcome everyone. And thank you everyone in the audience for joining us as well. I guess what probably makes the most sense would be for each of you to just give a brief introduction about who you are, and what you're working on, and then we can get into the questions. So I don't know, Zaki, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm Zaki. I was part of the original team that launched the Cosmos Hub. I'm co-founder of a protocol called Sommelier with my co-founder Christy. The sort of relevance to this conversation is Sommelier was probably one of the first. So Sommelier uses a Cosmos app chain, but our entire user experience is on Ethereum. Our Cosmos app chain drives a fairly popular Ethereum application that manages almost $100 million in TVL and really pioneered sort of the next generation in vault space. And we are exploring the idea of becoming an AVS in partnership with Ethos, but we are, and basically everyone who's building a coprocessor today builds it as is going down the AVS design pattern, and sort of an interesting trade-off about what has worked, what hasn't worked, and we can talk more about that with building a sort of an Ethereum aligned application, but using the in the Cosmos ecosystem.
I'm very interested to also hear more about how your journey has been. So I'm Butian, co-founder of Blockless. So Blockless, we are a network-neutral compute orchestration layer for powering modular applications, kind of doing what Celestia does for the modular blockchain. We take it one step further to break the application into each individual workload. And when we do that, two things happen. One is that developers, they can run any execution, serverless function, any type of application workload, combining it with verifiable, off-chain consensus or zero-knowledge proof, and then choose any blockchain for settlement. And because we remove the need for running ledger, right, it's extremely easy to run a node. An average user can also do that just through a web browser, contributing compute power like CPU, GPU, bandwidth, RAM to power those application workloads. And we are working with Eigenlayer, Symbiotic, and some of the other folks in the restaking space for providing the off-chain network framework for other developers to easily build their AVS, etc. Yeah, great to join the panel today.
Well, I'm Lauren, and I work for Ethos, and we are an AVS, and we serve as the coordination layer or mechanism for chains to opt in, bootstrap their validator set, and inherit ETH restake security. So.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. I guess a really interesting place to start, just to make sure everyone in the audience is on the same page, might be something like, what is an AVS, and why do they need security? And I guess maybe we can even broaden the conversation beyond that. I know Eigenlayer maybe doesn't want to have the Xerox effect on the word AVS, right? I think a lot of the restaking protocols either maybe don't call their restaked services AVSs, they call them whatever. So maybe you can also expand upon that, whether you think AVS is the appropriate term for all restake services, or there's nuances between them there, and then also just what it is in general and why they need security.
I can start. I also think that AVS is not such a good name. I see that some people within the Eigen team, they're calling it Eigen app, and I think even that is a better name. It essentially describes that, okay, we can leverage the on-chain assets for security for validating off-chain services. And when you do that, there's a whole variety of things you can do that extend beyond the blockchain service boundaries. Traditionally, blockchain is not capable of handling, for example, running AI, or it doesn't know anything outside its ledger when it comes to data. So those kind of things, they are now possible to be consumed and processed. And in general, we just call those off-chain services like AVS.
I think that was a pretty good definition. But I think the practical reality of an AVS is that what a user might experience can be quite diverse. It could be just like a service that like sort of is in the background of some application that they use, like a price oracle or an interoperability, or it could power like a bridge or an interoperability solution, or it could power its own L1. When people mean off-chain, it actually embeds like quite a large number of possible sort of things that like exist within a blockchain. It just means not on the like Ethereum, like a sort of thing. It sort of differentiates itself from like a L2, where the L2's sort of entire sort of canonical existence is embedded in a smart contract on Ethereum, even though it's supporting this like compression function over another blockchain. Whereas AVSs are things that are like secured by Ethereum, but not on Ethereum.
Yeah, to that point, like Ethos is effectively like an ecosystem in and of itself, right? So you span the gamut of different types of services that would inherit that security from the main Ethos chain.
Yeah, I think that makes. You want to go?
I would also just say that, you know, from my point of view, the relationship between like Neutron and Stride and the Cosmos Hump is the same as like AVS is to Ethereum.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer. I guess to dovetail from that, like, does every AVS or Eigen app or off-chain service, you know, whatever you want to call them, do they all need the same level of security, or do different AVSs only require certain amounts of security, and you know, what type of variables dictate how much security a particular off-chain service might need?
Sure, I mean, ultimately that's up to like individual chains themselves or services themselves, right? I think ultimately you want to mitigate the risk of, you know, like potential profit from, you know, corruption of the network. So at least for any type of service that is inheriting security via Ethos, right? It's up to you to opt in to figure out exactly how much security you may or may not need. But of course that will be, you know, different for everyone.
Like, I'm trying to think of counter argument for having more security. Is it really the more the better? Except for the part that you have to pay for the security that you acquire, right? And there's certain downside, like slashing risk involved for the security at stake. I think for all those considerations, ideally, you probably want like more than the kind of majority stake in terms of the minimum cost for overtaking the protocol, and that's kind of the underlying rule of thumb in terms of how much security is essential. And I think this is not like race staking specific. It has been in existence for a long time, like Cosmos or Cosmos Hub. It like is probably like one of the first or the primitive for how the shared security would work among the entire ecosystem.
So I think there are a couple of things that are just like worth noting. To the best of my knowledge, there aren't really any examples that we can point to in terms of economic security failures of like distributed consensus systems outside of proof of work systems. Like we have seen double spend attacks due to low economic security and insufficient hashing power in like the proof of work world, but in the sort of BFT proof of stake world, there hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, ever been a successful attack based on exploitation of low economic security, which is just like an interesting data point. So it's like, how much economic security do we need? We don't know. And what to me, it certainly has more to do with the fact that the economics of this. I would not go like full nihilism, but I would say that the economics of economic security are not well characterized. I don't think it's just the amount of assets that are delegated. Most validators are in some sense, some sort of ongoing business with a reputation. You know, the core people, the founders, et cetera, are doxxed. They have like protocol external economic incentives to behave honestly, to not steal money, et cetera. So I think these things are significant contributing factors. But it also doesn't. You know, from my mind, like there is a role for greater than zero economic security, but like especially when you move into like sort of a real yield regime. Like, so today on Sommelier, all staking rewards come from auctioning off fees generated by the protocol. Protocol generates like about 14, 15 ETH a month in fees, and those fees get auctioned off, and that drives staking rewards. And when you are operating in that, like, in a model where you're not just like printing tokens to generate economic security, you do have to, like, there are trade-offs, like how much do you reward token stakers, and it'll be interesting to see how those models work out, but I don't think that like virtually anything that is going on in like the sort of staking economic security world today is very rational.
Yeah, and I also agree, it's not just the absolute amount of security, but also like how decentralized, how concentrated those stakes are at. And I think like this, as an ecosystem, it's sort of a healthy approach that we're taking, working with institutional as well as, you know, the consumer node operators as well to pave our way towards further decentralization.
I want to take it back to like the essence of the panel, which is bootstrapping economic security. But I feel like before I do, all of you just raised some really interesting points about, you know, obviously Zaki, you mentioned, you know, we haven't seen many exploitations in proof-of-stake network, even ones that have low economic security. And maybe this is kind of due just because if the majority of the tokens are staked, it's like even if someone wanted to buy the tokens to do a 51% attack, like the supply or the float's not there for them to do that. And then obviously even if it's a small number of validator sets, they have this, you know, reputation that they wouldn't want to tarnish. But ultimately, between deciding whether you want to have this like sovereign validator set as a low economic security chain, or you want to plug into something like Eigenlayer or another restaking service, you know, doesn't it also just come down to like what actors you want to potentially reward either your token or your fees with? Like how can integrating with Eigenlayer or even Ethos, for example, be cheaper than, you know, rewarding your own native validator set with your native token? Are there specific reasons for this?
Sure. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to, you know, obviously, as a you know, like if you're trying to launch a chain product, et cetera. You know, I think now with the with opting in, right? You don't necessarily have to think about or worry about do I have to like devalue, right, my own token, depending, you know, to keep up with expected rewards, et cetera. So I think, for me at least, I think it's important that chains have sovereignty here in terms of being able to determine, you know, the best economic model that fits for them. So, and also their operators, stakers, community, et cetera. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I think definitely. There are a lot of moving parts for like AVS, for example, to sort out on their own. With that flexibility comes that responsibility. One thing I think a lot of like AVS talk about is really about the utility of their own token. Now that there are, for example, dual staking, as well as just leverage the restake assets for like incentivizing certain behaviors and getting certain like security sort of as the protection. And I think like depending on the application, of course there's pros and cons for each of those choices. And I think in general, flexibility is always good. I mean, when an option is free, just take it. You can always make changes as the bootstrap goes, and at certain point, you may even pass the bootstrap phase, right? And that could also mean you can even, you know, completely remove the kind of restaking model and even just run on with your own token. I think what's good is that we have this sort of like the premium that you don't have to pay when like some of the AVS are relatively small early on. They can cold start without solving the problem of the capital.
Okay, great, thank you. I think like to get back to the original part of the panel, just to make sure we cover that as well, it would be a question like, what are some of the most popular ways to bootstrap economic security for an AVS, right? And maybe as a follow-on to that, what are some of the most important trade-offs to consider when deciding, which way you want to go?
So I think right now what you're seeing in the AVS world is a lot of like points programs, airdrops, token printing essentially. I mostly think of like what is going on in sort of the restaking world right now is kind of a new version of an ICO. People, rather than people giving capital to a project, they're locking up capital, but they're not securing very much. Mostly, nothing has slashing turned on. Very few projects are in mainnet, but there's a lot of. But on the other hand, one of the hardest things I think for Sommelier is that like we bootstrapped knowledge and visibility and liquidity around the token largely in the Cosmos ecosystem, whereas we bootstrapped knowledge and credibility of the app and the Ethereum ecosystem, and once those two things like drifted apart, no matter how hard I try, I have not been able to put them back together, and that has been a real frustration. And I think the AVS tokens, and we'll see how they do, but like AVS is, I think like a big part of that is this idea of, hey, if we use point programs, we use restaking, we are going to have a stronger synergy between our user base on Ethereum and our token holder base on Ethereum, which was not something that we could do with Sommelier at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think like both things can be true in that like things are a little bit up in the air. There's a lot of restaked ETH out there, and not a ton of sinks for that. But I would argue also like a lot of these mechanisms facilitate projects to be able to really just, if you care about your protocol and your product, then you do benefit from this in some capacity, and maybe incentives align at some point in the future. So it's early days, I think.
I think they've touched pretty much all the aspects about bootstrapping the economy or the economic side of things. Maybe like I can talk more about like the other aspects that as a project that need to really bootstrap the other kind of resources, that being the community, of course, and also the technical aspect. Especially as like projects starting small, the tech side of things, there are a lot to do. And the beauty of like blockchain or smart contract is basically for developers to have the resource to only focus on writing their business logic with smart contract, right? They don't have to essentially just like rebuild what's already there with Ethereum or EVM. And so for Blockless, we're trying to do the same for the off-chain network, essentially making it as easy as writing smart contract for developers to now do like one person doing the job of essentially a team of 10 people. They don't have to worry about networking level of things, load balancing, or like messaging, fault tolerance, etc. And to that, I think with all those building blocks, we're enabling more developers to really participate in the innovation.
I think that makes sense, but also like even more simply, right? If you're someone that's looking to deploy an AVS, or maybe you're deploying just an application, right? You could deploy it as an AVS directly, right? On EigenLayer with your own EigenPod and bootstrap your own operator set. That's one way to go. Or you can say, you know what, I'm just going to plug into Ethos because you already have, pooled security in your own operator set, and it's, a UX improvement, more frictionless that way. Or maybe you're deploying as, some type of roll-up on AltLayer, right, which is, I guess, like a shared security AVS as well, and that could be some way you're connecting to the EigenLayer ecosystem. Are there any other ways that developers should be considering to like bootstrap or like any existing toolings that have already been developed in EigenLayer that maybe people aren't as familiar with, which could be a good way for them to consider deploying from a bootstrapping economic security perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like Blockless is another option, obviously. Like if you don't want to have like multiple chains, each one of them taking care of certain aspects of the application, yeah, you can just essentially opt into building, just launching, not even as a chain, right? And AVS can be a chain or not, and whatever that makes sense for handling the settlement, and then the rest of the stack is more kind of like an intent-driven, or if in some specific use case like DeFi, for example, calling it the co-processor, those are some of the other ways to just have this stack for your application.
And I guess like maybe something that everyone can expand upon is like what are the cost considerations that come with these choices, right? Because obviously like a major benefit projects get from integrating with EigenLayer is token distribution and like additional channels that way. But they're also like there is a cost to themselves, right? Whether they have their own AVS token or they're distributing cash or whatever. So how does that work?
I mean, one of the things that we don't really have a good sense of is like, you know, if you're paying in a token and you're distributing a token to the like liquid restaking tokens, how much of that like is going to get sold by the liquid restaking token protocol, right? You know, I think we're still in this like sort of like before any of the economics have been figured out era. And while there's certain aspects of like the cost structure that like are very appealing, like you should be able to generate, you should have to have much smaller amount of inflation to convince people to hold an illiquid asset, some new coin, and stake with it than it should be to get people to hold Bitcoin, ETH, etc. Right? Like it should be much easier and should cost a lot less. But right now we're still in this mode of, you know, nobody's really figured out the economics. Most AVSs, their token generation events are sometime in the future. People are mostly talking about airdrops. All of this stuff is like largely like pre-economic.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe the other thing that's like not really explored as much is like the decentralization of that, you know, restaked ETH. In terms of, you know, maybe you negotiate with a couple of LRTs, but then the decentralization of, you know, the security that's committed to your service is up to them. So I think will play out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like it's the unit of measurement when it comes to value is kind of at core. Now, like the consensus that people normally measure in terms of stable coin, right? It's still packed to traditional currency, and when it comes to like the next more kind of stable, like non-stable is like BTC or Ethereum, right? As in, there's a common like consensus for the value of storage, and the other derivatives like LRT. There's always risks associated with its pegging to Ethereum, and then when you keep adding layers to those derivatives of assets, there's essentially more risk introduced into the system. And when things are going well, I mean, we don't really see the effect because things are packed perfectly. But if there is another kind of terror event and things would go down in spiral, that's when we see those interrelated risks associated with those assets. And we're not even talking about, you know, like the AVS tokens just yet, but like those are, I think, are problems that we definitely need to keep in mind, as in like maybe there's like models, metrics for measuring those kind of risks.
I mean, I think stake share in this case is maybe starting to, that's like going in the direction of trying to understand and potentially mitigate risk of that type of like cascading failure of the system, so.
Yeah, that reminds me of something I was reading lately about, you know, there's almost a supply overhang of restaked ETH, right, and not enough AVSs yet, you know, for that restaked ETH to be like staked to, and maybe this will create some type of financial crisis where they're not able to continue offering attractive enough, you know, yields on staked ETH because you have way more ETH, like so much demand for people right now because it's a new project to stake ETH into EigenLayer, but not enough AVSs or use cases for that ETH yet, or not enough like financial, like proceeds being generated from AVS is yet to continue to incentivize all of this ETH. So I don't know if that's something that you guys have been hearing about too lately, or if you have any thoughts related to like needing to create, additional on-chain use cases for actual applications in the restaked ecosystem, so that we can continue to like make sure ETH remains restaked and yields are continued to be able to be generated at a high enough level to incentivize restakers.
Sure. I mean, I think like if you can create an ecosystem that, in our case, where there is a force multiplier and launching and inheriting the security and participating specifically with that ecosystem, then yeah, you're creating value that's like a little bit larger than just potentially each individual service, right? One-to-one, operating on eigenlayers. So, I think it will come down to, the value that services provide. It's still super early though, so I think that's like a little bit too early to call.
I think essentially like restake assets, the marginal cost for that assets to be restaked and validate something else is close to zero. So technically, it's a free assets that you can acquire for like pooled security. Attributable security, maybe not. So like it's fine, like even if the yield is extremely low, if it's pooled security, it's still okay. What's not okay is when slashing happens, right? You would think, okay, my ETH has this like almost risk-free payout. Now it's not risk-free. So I think a crucial piece in this is really trying to mitigate the slashing as much as we could. So what we've been trying to do at Blockless is to essentially, before the on-chain slashing condition is triggered, we have this off-chain consensus to validate the execution prior to triggering any on-chain slashing conditions. Or zero-knowledge proof is another example. Essentially, you don't need slashing because the proof, it says enough about the execution, like whether you should trust it or not. I think those are some of the approaches that we're taking to mitigate the slashing risks.
I think one of these things is really going to be a question of like, I think a lot of these things become a lot more material if the systems truly become more decentralized. I think in a practical matter, like, Eigenlayer is going to have like a veto committee on slashing. I think that will be enough to mitigate catastrophic sort of correlated events from sort of happening across the ecosystem. Like one particular data center goes down or something like that. And Eigenlayer also is like discouraging projects for having liveness-related slashing. I think we're still going to be in a very early stages of the decentralization of these AVSs, which is going to make it more like risk-free yield. But I think it'll be interesting to see how those tensions play out in the longer run, and if there is actually sufficient demand for true attributable economic security.
I guess in the final remaining minute here, I'd love to just get all of your opinions on if there's anything you didn't get a chance to mention related to bootstrapping, AVS, economic security, anything yet you'd like to share to the audience as a takeaway. Would love to just turn it over to you.
Maybe we can see like if there's still any questions, anything that we haven't covered.
You do that too. Any Q&A from the audience? We've got time for maybe one question.
Well, I would just say that, we've been seeing a lot of Cosmos chains sort of proposing changing their economic security model to join like, Cosmos Hub PSS. Fewer chains have really, I think Sommelier is somewhat unique in terms of being a chain that like wants to explore changing its security model from native staking to restaking. It's going to be a big question to see, does this work out for us? I think it's a super fascinating experiment.
I would say like we are at a stage to downplay the chains, but more about like the use cases. So yeah.
But yeah, I would agree in general. I think, again, be looking forward to obviously launch and then seeing what ends up, launching on Ethos for us and where that goes. So.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time. Everyone in the audience should give the wonderful panelists a big round of applause.
Thank you.